As they are making their way forward, we invite you to rise in body or in spirit and speak aloud the words of affirmation, which can be found on the back of your bulletin. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve human need. For these high purposes do we unite in worship.
Okay. We light our chalice this morning, grateful for the love that we experience in this beloved community. May the flame light the way for all who seek such abundance.
Our reading this morning comes from the Reverend Dr. Rebecca Parker, theologian and former president of our UU Star King School for the Ministry. It comes from an essay in her book of collected essays called Blessing the World. According to popular religion, we are living on the eve of the apocalypse. A catastrophic cosmic struggle is coming when God's forces will battle the forces of evil. Evil empires will be destroyed, and from their collapse will rise a new heaven and a new earth. In place of the 1,000 years of wrong will come the 1,000 years of right. Religious liberalism, Unitarian Universalism included, has our own variations on the apocalyptic dream. Our version doesn't imagine that old worlds are destroyed and new ones created simply by the act of God. We put ourselves into the drama. We assign ourselves the task of dismantling evil empires, and we go to work hammering together the New Jerusalem. Think of the evil empires whose ruin we have tried to orchestrate: patriarchy, racism, homophobia, militarism, economic injustice, environmental abuse. And we know the new world that we want to put in place. I am grateful for the energy, commitment, and service that liberal faith inspires, but I have begun to believe that this theological worldview may no longer be adequate for our times. If we can imagine that the apocalypse is not ahead of us, but already behind us, consider how we might regard our religious task differently. We are living in a post-slavery, post-Holocaust, post-Vietnam, post-Hiroshima, post-9/11 world. We are living in the aftermath of collective violence that has been severe, massive, and traumatic. The scars from slavery, genocide, and meaningless war mark our bodies. We are living in the midst of rainforest burning and the rapid death of species, the growing pollution of the air and water, and the mutations of racism and violence. At the same time that much is breaking down in our society, there are arenas of great vitality and freshness. The arts are flourishing. New movements in religion and spirituality are blossoming. Academic scholarship is bursting with contributions from people of color, diverse feminist voices, queer perspectives, post-colonial writers, and more. Computer technology is creating new patterns of human connection in cyberspace. Cross-cultural encounters and countercultural movements are opening up new possibilities in medicine, business, religion, and the arts. Living in these times, I feel the simultaneous presence of violence, chaos, breakdown, loss, creativity, liberation, possibility, recovery, connection, and empowerment. While we are actively dismantling some things, we are bringing some new things to life. How do we live in this world? What is our religious task? The task, Rebecca Parker continues, is to walk among the ruins, to find what can be saved and gather up the materials to rebuild. In the aftermath of the apocalypse, the religious enterprise can be imagined as a kind of salvage work, recognizing the resources that sustain and restore life, resources that are ready at hand, not in some distant promised land. Our religious task, once we recognize that we are living after the apocalypse, is not to build up the perfect world, but to protect and preserve and nurture what we can. Here ends our reading. When I was a kid in a small town, I'd often go to the Burt family's house for babysitting. Their house had a big sign next to it, Burt's Salvage. The dad, John Burt, was a Vietnam vet. Unkempt and with a scraggly beard, John spent his days scouring junkyards, demolition sites, and flea markets for treasure, and then tinkering with it at home. John was always finding ways to repair or transform what he found. In his barn, he'd be pulling things apart, experimenting, putting them back together, shining them up. My parents would pick me up and see the wind-up truck that he'd repaired and exclaim, "I had that when I was a kid in 1949. We'd marvel at the furniture he'd make from reclaimed wood. One day we bought a big cabinet shelf unit from him, which we lovingly titled the John Burt Thing, when it sat in our living room for decades afterward. I didn't know anything about post-traumatic stress disorder back then, but I could tell John Burt seemed like a man in emotional pain. The Vietnam War had been for him like it was for so many. He had come home to his little town, and not everything was resolved in him or in the world around him. And yet, he salvaged, sorting through the junk, finding what was worth saving, putting things together creatively, creating beauty, utility, even joy. What is our religious task as people here in southwestern Colorado in 2022? Here, where democracy is hanging on by a thread, where the forests have burned and will burn some more. Here, where the people are divided between deep red and deep blue, and where a gun-toting conspiracy theorist has represented you in Congress. Here, where we are not sure what the future will bring. These we could once depend on, these things we could once depend on, were crumbling. As the new Arcade Fire song puts it, we are standing at the end of the American empire, something that many of us didn't used to think we could ever dream about losing, as the song says. Maybe we feel neutral about it, like the old REM song, "It's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine." But I certainly don't. Mind you, I believe some things need to crumble, but we don't yet know how to sustain life and care for each other as those things fall down. And that worries me deeply. We are up against tremendous forces, human forces that are fundamentally anti-human and anti-humane. Our whole Western US is drying up and heating up. Our markets, built on a house of cards called endless growth, are teetering. And we can't trust that even the minimal safety nets that support well-being are even going to be there when we need them. When I think of all this, my heart literally hurts. I feel a deep sadness, a fear, a pain. Of course we do. As Unitarian Universalists, this pain that we feel is there because we know we are connected with all life here together, with our fates bound up in one another's on this precious, spinning, planning planet Earth. Our faith communities have a unique role and a special purpose. We are here to bless life with wisdom and meaning. We are here to hold and help and heal one another. Here we are uncovering and upcycling what is worth keeping. And we are building something beautiful and worthy together, something multifaceted and brilliant, made of materials old and new. We are building a congregation and we are building ourselves. We are, so to speak, always under construction. This is something that I've treasured about our faith ever since I was a UU kid, that we honor the ways that our religious beliefs can grow and change with us our whole lives long. Our personal beliefs and practices are always open to change based on our life experiences. There is no fixed place where our beliefs need to arrive in order to be a Unitarian Universalist. Our faith gives us permission to always be under construction from cradle to grave. But it's not about perfection or even necessarily about progress. In the 50s, when my dad was a Unitarian kid in Massachusetts, his congregation spoke this once common affirmation in church each Sunday. We affirm the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, the leadership of Jesus, salvation by character, and the progress of mankind onward and upward forever. That is overly optimistic. That optimism fell away. But even in the Unitarian Universalism of the 1970s and the 1980s, I grew up with a strong belief in the forward motion of humanity, that we'd become progressively wiser, more enlightened, more civilized as time went on. You know, we'd be beyond racism, poverty, disease, and war. Instead, here we are, right in it. We've made some real progress as a world, as a country, and I don't want to minimize that, but here in 2022, we are far from the futuristic utopia that we might have imagined. We are less like the Jetsons and more like John Burt's old salvage yard, scrambling to find what's worth saving, looking for the wisdom, the inspiration, and the creativity that will enable us to carry on in the face of impending collapse. What is the work of our religious communities in this time? It's certainly not to put a happy face on all of this, call it God's work, and tie it up in a neat little bow. We couldn't do that if we tried. No, as Reverend Dr. Rebecca Parker wrote in our reading this morning, we are called to be engaged in a kind of theological salvage work. Our task, she writes, is to walk among the ruins, find what can be saved, and gather up materials to rebuild. In the aftermath of the apocalypse, she continues, the religious enterprise can be imagined as a kind of salvage work, recognizing the resources that sustain and restore life, resources that are ready at hand, not in some distant promised land. And you, UUFD, as a congregation in a time of interim ministry, you are engaging in your own salvage work. What around here is worth saving? What needs to be reinforced, rebuilt, upcycled, or sustained? Here you can tap into your deep well of resources, the kind of life-sustaining resources that UU communities offer. Things like our teachings on how to live peacefully with others, our ways of decision-making that invoke respect and caring and consensus, our practices of holding one another in times of grief and trauma, our traditions around children and youth, nurturing, protecting, educating, and empowering them, our skills for living with justice and compassion, and the stamina for sticking with justice and compassion even when times get rough, our collective wisdom on how to go on when we want to give up, Our spiritually grounded ways of undoing and unlearning racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, and other biases that divide one from another. Our traditions on how to apologize, make amends, and restore relationship when we hurt people. And at the core of it all, our wisdom and methods that create pathways to experience the sacred within, among, and beyond us. There is so much. We are continually preserving, uncovering, fitting together, and upcycling in religious community. In these tenuous times, we are so deeply interdependent on one another. I believe that all of us, somewhere buried deep in our human nature, recognize that all this belief in go it alone, human individualism, and human exceptionalism is just false. We belong to one another. And when I say we, I mean everything that is alive on this green blue planet. We know this deep in our bones. Ancient spiritual traditions and Colorado's many indigenous religions affirm this. And it's showing up in new forms biology, astronomy, and quantum physics, too. We are all connected. This worldwide pandemic has been one huge lesson on the limits of individualism and the vital importance of collective thinking, where all of us matter and us keeps getting larger all the time. Our progress might not be upward or onward, but our hearts and our souls can always grow, especially in a community like the UU Fellowship of Durango. When I first started working closely with your congregation in 2017, you were in your 4th year of ministry with Reverend Katie Kandarian Morris, your first minister ever. It was an exciting time. 2 years before, you'd been recognized by the Unitarian Universalist Association as a breakthrough congregation because you'd grown so much, not just in numbers, but you'd grown in spirit, in vision, in depth. I visited in person in 2018, meeting with the board and attending Sunday services, and I could feel the vibrance of the people and of the place. It felt like you had a positive, can-do attitude as a congregation. Over the next 2 years in my conversations with leaders in your congregation, as well as Reverend Katie, I could tell that some tensions were building. The kind of tension that you could say is normal in any group's life cycle. You've heard of forming, storming, norming, and performing, those stages of group development articulated by Bruce Tuckman over 50 years ago. Well, you experienced some storming, some conflicts that just kept cycling around and not getting resolved. You experienced some real tensions around questions like these. What do we do as a community when some people are unhappy with how things are going? How do we delegate power and decision-making authority among us? Who's in charge here? How do we best minister to young families? What is a good sustainable size for our staff? These are important life cycle kinds of questions for a congregation to answer. And this time of interim ministry is a wonderful time to explore those questions. It's a time for salvage work. The UU Fellowship of Durango is always under construction, always. A long-term salvage project in the best sense, and combining old tradition with new, polishing up gems of wisdom so they shine. But especially now, with your new interim minister, Reverend Barbara Queeman, you have a wonderful opportunity to look at who you are becoming, and how you want to be together. The salvaging saved John Burt in a way. He was still clearly a man in pain, but saving isn't about taking away all the pain. Certainly, the saving work of our religious community is about bringing meaning, purpose, community, love, a sense of the holy to one another. It doesn't take away all the pain, but it's a salve, a balm. Your engaging with a new interim minister as we all emerge from COVID is particularly meaningful. All of you at UUFD are emerging into this time and this place together, like trees spreading your roots toward one another, weaving your lives into a collective that will grow and leaf and fruit in ways that you can and can't predict. Bring yourself here, your whole self, with your heart that's hurting and strong and vibrantly alive. Here, there is a salve to cure loneliness and meaninglessness and disconnection. Here, we dust off and polish up the old, creatively infuse it with the new, and bring it into our lives and into the world. Bless you, UU Fellowship of Durango and Reverend Barbara Queeman, as you move through your saving work together. Amen, and blessed be.